For our next session, we're going to have Matt Ricketts with us. Matt is one of the great advisors in our Interior Ranch program who supports our ranchers on ranch planning. He also has his own business, RRS, and he'll be talking today about grazing practices and a lot of other beneficial ways to think about your property, in particular forage and animal health. So he'll get into those details. One of the stories I love to tell about Matt, we were doing one of these similar seminars out in Oregon, and we were driving 70 miles an hour along the highway in Oregon, and he spotted a plant that he wanted to put on the table for one of the presentations. And so we pulled over, and Matt hopped out, and I can, we're in the field, and I can't see the difference between two things I'm looking at from 5 feet away, but Matt at 70 miles an hour can spot a plant difference. So he's got a lot of expertise in that sense, and we're looking forward to learning more. Thanks.
Okay. Do I need this?
Yeah, you do, yeah.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Ben. Well, it's good to see everybody here. My name is Matt Ricketts. I've been working with ranchers to help them plan profitable, practical, and sustainable operations for over 40 years throughout Montana and the Western United States. I grew up in Oregon, but I got my formal education here, and informal, really in a lot of ways, here in Montana. My formal education is range science, forestry, forest management, and with emphasis in watershed management and hydrology, and soil science and wildlife. But really, the education started when you started working with folks. Because there was a lot of questions over 40 years ago when I started that ranchers would ask me, and I was like, well, I'm not sure. Particularly when it revolved around animal nutrition, livestock nutrition. Because we didn't know a lot. Range science, range nutrition, as we're going to discuss just briefly, is a fairly young science. And even range science, as you'll see, is a young science. On my mom's side of the family, we have a ranch in northeastern Oregon, and it started in the early 1860s. My cousin's operating it now, and it's still operating. And this is the 5th generation, which may sound funny because I heard a ranch starting at 1900 and they had 6 generations. Our generations kind of went long before they had kids. But yeah, and then on my dad's side, they had a lumber mill. And the community there is still the same as when I grew up, about 1,700 people. And it's 100 miles from anything through a windy road to get out. So that's just a little bit about my background. And then I've had the opportunity to do a lot of on the ranch, on the ground research, learning about mineral nutrition and those types of things that we really didn't have any idea of because we actually did biopsied. I biopsied hundreds of head of cattle on 10 different ranches over 2 years of time, monthly, took blood serum samples and other things and other research-oriented things that were on the ranch, practical, that you can't replicate and probably won't replicate again. So with that, let's see. Oh, wrong one. Okay. Here's some of the things that I hope you'll get out of today's discussion over the next hour and 15 minutes is drought and weed resistance. What is it? Okay, and the importance of it to the profitability and sustainability of our ranches. Now, I could have easily titled this Healthy Land equals healthy animals, or healthy or productive animals, which equals profitable ranching or sustainable ranching, because that's really what it's all about. This is the essence of that. And working with the natural world. We have to realize that ranching is really working ecologically, managing ecologically for the most part. Farming is more agronomic. We're changing things more so. We have inputs. But if we work ecologically and understand what God has already put out there on the landscape and work with it it can be a powerful tool, and you can save a lot of money. So, keys to healthy land and healthy animals. Hopefully we'll have a little bit better understanding of that. What is overgrazing and what is undergrazing? Because they're both detrimental to the productivity of your land. And here's a little nutrition thing. This grass right here, blue bunch wheatgrass, it's the state grass of Montana, grows throughout the Northwest, northern plains, grows all around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem area. This particular grass provides, when it's dried out just like this, all the energy that a lactating cow needs. That's its highest nutritional demand for the year. Okay, so we'll start there. Okay, so, and then animal nutritional wisdom. It's a newer concept. You know, it's funny how ranchers see things, and they're not exactly sure. They've not done a science project on anything, but they think they see something. And often it takes science years down the road to actually prove what they saw. Think about that. Okay? But we like to prove it because if we can prove that that's how things work, we can replicate it on the next operation. Either the neighbor or the next state over, or several states over. Now, so that's something to think about. Animal and grazing land nutrition, just touch on it. Really, your livestock are your harvesting and marketing mechanism. Think about the last drought. What happened in the last drought? The last drought around here, bad drought, was 98 to 2007. Does anybody, any ranchers here remember that? Yeah. And again, I've told it for 40 years, told rancher groups, Montana wouldn't be Montana if it rained all the time. We'd be like Iowa, or Illinois or Ohio, something like that, or the very far coast. It would be different. Drought is what forms Montana, and we're going to see some of the things that God has provided as far as plants nutritionally in drier environments that help nutritionally, and how that changes as we go up in precip. Okay? So what plants provide what nutrients, and are the weeds I'm killing really weeds? We need to understand that. And give it some illustrations on that. And really a question that all landowners and all ranchers want to know, is my land healthy? And if it's not, can I improve it? And that's a big question. And you have to understand potential and the setting that that piece of land is in, what we call an ecological site. And we'll define that to really be able to answer that question. So you're harvesting and marketers of your crop. It's really important to know that your forages are your crop. We're often led to believe that it's just the grass. And I've already said that these native grasses, and particularly blue bunch wheatgrass and grasses like it, provide all the energy that a lactating cow needs. And that will be its highest energy demand for the production year. So, we're going to focus a lot on livestock, but there's other users of the rangeland. And we have to account for all of that. And sometimes maybe that's what we're using to harvest and market our crop, our forages. Mule deer. White-tailed deer, yeah. There's a number of things, and obviously the elk. Now these have a lot of dietary overlap with livestock, so it can be more of an issue in places. But some places, that's what they're managing for. They want elk. But how do we manage them? We're not going to get into a lot of that. We don't have time for it, but there's antelope. There's even our game birds. This is a non-native bird, Hungarian partridge, Huns, gray partridge, whatever you know them by. But there's a lot of birds and stuff that use these rangelands. And bighorn sheep. Now, all these wildlife have specific habitat requirements. Like bighorn sheep, this is at the Pryor Mountain Wild Horse Range, which I had the opportunity to author a study on that. And we had to look at dietary overlap and spatial overlap with wildlife. But bison, wild horses, or just domesticated horses. Now, wild horses, feral horses, they all had their domesticated roots, and they got away, and so we have the wild horses. But we have to look at that. So, what's different and why? We're going to look at the 4 biological laws. The 4 biological laws are equivalent to the laws of the physical nature. But these are I title these biological nature, but they're like the physical laws of nature. You cannot violate them. If I step off this stage, what's going to happen? I'm going to go. We know that. I mean, I don't have to have a lot of faith in that. I know what's going to happen because that's the physical law of nature. Gravity has an impact. Well, these are the same way. They're exactly the same way. And I'm not going to cover all of the physiological things that go on with a plant through the year. We don't have time for that this afternoon. But if you have questions, we can talk later. But we're going to cover the main things. But before we get to that, I want to mention something, and it's called the profit formula. Because I mentioned that these things would equate to profitable ranching. You know, healthy land translates to healthy animals and productive animals, which translates to profitable/sustainable ranching. You can't have profitable ranching without also being sustainable. Because I can be profitable and come up with alternatives with a rancher as we develop that plan together for their operation that may be profitable in the short run, but if it's not sustainable, you're going to see all of the ramifications to that. So, profit formula. Is anyone familiar with that? You can just raise a hand if you're familiar, if you've heard this. It's fairly simple, but profit equals price times production minus costs. Okay? And so what can we really affect? I know since World War II, I remember on our family's ranch, small cattle, and they had big, deep bellies, not real long legs, and Hereford-based. Actually, it started shorthorns, but we won't get into all that. But there was an evolution through time, and even the sheep came and went for a time. But then following World War II, our population really started to take off. And the push, by extension, any help that our ranching community and ag community was getting was to produce more and more and more. So we started pushing for bigger frames, which meant bigger calves, which meant bigger frames means more milk, which means more nutrients. And where's that going to come from? It started coming out of this. And so we have what we call the frame creep even in more recent years, where we try to keep the frame down, to keep the milk down, and to get a more productive animal that's yielding more calf per body condition score 5 weight of that mother cow. But it always creeps up. And I'm not going to get into all the reasons, but it's a natural evolution of things. But we started to exceed the ability of our ranges and our pastures to provide those nutrients. So really, we have to start looking at costs. What's the cost of producing, and can we be more sustainable, and we can start taking out things like weed spraying, reduce that. Because I know ranches and clients that I have that are spraying like crazy. But it's because of what we're going to talk about here now. So, and we also supplement nutritionally, because often we were told that it's all about the grass. So we're going to learn here in just a second quickly that it isn't all about just the grass. The forbs and the shrubs are extremely important in certain environments. And as we get into wetter environments, as we go back east, I was working on a ranch out in central South Dakota here earlier this spring, and the battle is against, because they're getting to 22 inches plus, and it goes more, you get more precip the further you go east from there. And they're battling all these introduced species. So we'll touch on that, hopefully, if we have time. Okay, if you keep down the shoot, we kill the root. Okay, blue bunch wheatgrass. This is blue bunch wheatgrass. On a grass plant, about as much foliage or current year's growth that you see above ground, that's how much root you have below ground. Top growth, current year's growth, is proportional to the root growth. Okay, that's the general rule. And you can start thinking about carbon here too, because that's a carbon storage house. So every year, a grass plant prunes off about 1/3 of its roots, and they have to be replaced. So if we overutilize the top, root system stops growing. Okay, and I'm going to illustrate that right now. And it stops growing for a period of time depending on how severe that defoliation is. Now also remember here is that every year, this is a cool season plant. Now we have warm season and cool season plants, but we're going to focus in on cool season right now. It's the dominant around the greater Yellowstone and throughout most of Montana, although we have warm season species, as I'll point out also. But a cool season plant replaces its roots in April, May, and June. And there's a time in there that's about 2 weeks that it actually is setting the number of leaves that it's going to grow next year. It's kind of like breeding season for your cattle or for a wildlife population. If you disrupt that, you can have a major impact, either nutritionally or just physically disrupt it, or you're breeding in a really hot period of time with low forage quality. You can have an impact on pregnancy rates and breed up. So that's what happens with the grass plant. If we hit it really hard and really hard is only 60% use or more by weight. So we can not only reduce root systems, but we'll reduce the number of leaves next year up to 30%. So where you would have had 10 leaves, you'll only have 7. Okay, so like I said, not very long ago, this fellow named Kreider did this research. That's 1954. That's not that long ago. And he found a single clipping of 80% or more, all root growth stopped. 80% or more by weight is right about in here on this plant. It all varies with how much growth you have above ground, that current year's growth. The bigger the plant, the higher it's going to be on the plant. The smaller the plant, it tends to be lower. Okay, but 80% or more. A single clipping of 50 to 70% resulted in the partial root growth stoppage. But here, repeated clippings, okay, of 70% or more resulted in no root growth. That's what we continue to repeat it. So like if you have those big boss cows that are down in the draws, getting the prime forage, and they're always producing good for you, but they make sure all the other cows are kicked out. So you can't have a whole herd of these, frame score 7 cows, 1,500 pounds or whatever, 1,400 pounds, and have them do well on the uplands too. But that's how those particular cows work. And so they're down there where there's moisture, there's sub-irrigation, there's this or that, and you're getting regrowth. So they're right on that regrowth. In fact, we see them on that regrowth about every 7 to 9 days, roughly. And all that is it isn't rocket science. It's just that in 7 to 9 days, you're getting enough regrowth there because there's moisture in the ground that they get another bite. Okay, but we're going to see the problem with that when we talk a little nutrition. And here's the problem with it for the health of the plant. That also repeated clippings between 50 to 60%, we're still somewhere between 63 to 100% of the roots stop growing. But here's the take-home message right here. Root growth stoppage did not occur in both single and repeated clippings only when 40% or less of the top growth was removed. Now this is interesting because one of my great uncles and my great grandpa, but I didn't get to spend time with him. He died early when I was young. but I did spend it with my great uncle. He was born in 1888, which is just, I mean, I spent lots of time just sitting quietly with him, listening, but now I wish I could spend time with him and ask him questions, because he lived from the horse and buggy days, no electricity out on the ranches, nothing, to the computer age and the jet age. But he wrote a book, and he was a past vice chairman of the National Cattlemen's Association, and he wrote a book, and in that, one of the things he wrote in the book was that they noticed that when they left old grass, it wasn't wasted. The grass and the forages were actually healthier. They were stronger. They were more sustainable. But you know, he's not the only one who noticed that, and he passed away in the early 70s, about 73. He's not the only one. I've worked with many old ranchers around the state over this 40 plus years, and somehow they got this concept of conservative grazing. Now, it may not be the most efficient for the operation economically, but you'd go out on their ranges and you saw a lot of good, you might see some overgrazed stuff, and you saw a lot of undergrazed stuff, but overall, that ranch was in good shape. It was fairly healthy. In fact, really healthy. And I've seen that from east to west across the state. But those ranchers have passed on. I can't think of one that I know right off. There's some with some of those ideas, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that here. And here's another way to explain this by volume removed. And here at 50%, 2 to 4%, you're just starting to see root growth stoppage. Now, I have to say, this is a moving target, because this really represents stuff that's like 11 inches, 12 inches plus, up to like maybe 20 inches. As we go down and we get into the desertic basins, anything that's a desert, 5 to 9 inches average precip. The real figure is closer to 35%. That's the amount of the top growth you need to remove. Now that's interesting, because I got to think, wow, what about that last drought we had? That was kind of like a desert. We weren't getting that much moisture in the growing season or even throughout the whole year. So it can be a moving target. If you're really managing and on top of things, you're going to watch when things get drier that maybe you adjust your use levels on those key species. Now, as we get wetter, maybe a little bit more, like under our pivots or any irrigated pastures, you could take a little bit more and still probably be okay. See, not a lot, but a little bit. So the take half, leave half rule is a general rule of thumb. So, just so you see, if, let's say my animals were in there and they kept grazing the regrowth throughout the growing season, April, May, and June, this plant, if it didn't replace the third of the roots it was pruning that year, the next year it would be 2/3 the size it was the year before, and so on. And if that process continues, then it eventually dies out. And there's other processes that go on that will ensure that those taller statured, more productive plants will die out. And these plants are the plants that will dominate in that historic plant community or that potential native plant community. They're the best adapted to utilizing the soil nutrients, the soil moisture, and the number one important nutrient for growth. And what would that be? Does anybody have an idea? I already said moisture, so. Sunlight. It's sunlight. We take that for granted. So what happens in undergrazing? Undergrazing, we don't get disturbance of the grass plant. And we start to get all of this old stuff, and you can't see it really well here, but, and this isn't a great example, but you'll see gray matter, lots of gray matter. And that, and research, more recent research has determined that The quality of the light and the amount of light determines the number of tillers that will be set for next year. And it initiates their growth the next year. And I gotta say this, because if you went to ag school, you were in range classes or something, just like me, you learned that, oh yeah, the carbohydrates, they go get stored in the roots, below ground. Well, we've later found this out, that they're not. They're actually stored in 3 places, not 2. We used to say, go down to the roots, then the tillers draw on that and start growing in the spring. And then it's in the seed. Well, there's one other place, right at the base of the stem above ground. And the stuff that's stored, the carbohydrates that are stored above ground, don't go to initiate root growth below ground. That's the stuff that went below ground. It's used like, the analogy is like a little car battery to get your car going, okay? That gets your car moving and then it starts. But if your battery's dead, your engine's dead. So if we remove that within a 1/4 inch of the ground surface physically, or we expose it by not having old stuff in there, then next spring, and if we had really cold weather and an open winter, we could see die-off. You could have the healthiest plant with great root systems, but for some reason it was physically altered, and it could be fire right before winter sets in, and there's no regrowth. That could expose it. In the right conditions, you can kill that plant. Now, I've, over the years, had lots of ranchers show me, yeah, I don't know, this grass was perfectly healthy, and now I've got dead patches all over. So that's one of the reasons for that. So, okay, nature does not like bare spots. It's going to keep some type of cover on the ground. This is a principle you can't get around, and the more I work with it and the millions of acres that I've surveyed and assessed and inventoried, I'm more convinced than ever. Every year I get like, man, it just jumps out every time I see it. And I'll show you some examples here. Okay, we need to describe an ecological site. I mentioned that. An ecological site, we can subdivide land throughout the world into an ecological site. But let's talk about rangeland. Rangeland is land that's made up of native plants primarily, and this ecological site in this place, this is in the Gardner Basin, 11 inches average precip at this site. That's what they receive, right about that. It's a silty limey ecological site right here. Silty limey, which means it's better than 20 inches deep. It has good texture, a loamy type texture in general. And this is in the northern Rocky Mountain valleys south here in Montana. Now, why we distinguish that? Because there's silty limey down in Arizona. But it's maybe 11 inches precip. But that's different than up here in Montana because temperature's different, the wind patterns are different, the growing season's different, and it results in a different amount of vegetation. We talk in terms of dry weight, pounds per acre, or tons per acre if the ecological site produces that. And so that's number one that differentiates one ecological site from another where we'd give it a different name. The next thing is the types of plants that it grows. Grasses, forbs, shrubs, that sort of thing. Grass-likes. And it'll be in a different proportion. And then, so here's an ecological site is there any questions on that ecological site? That we're describing, we can describe different states, but just to keep it simple, we're going to focus on the potential native plant community, that climax plant community. Any questions? And just to note here we have some very shallow ecological sites here. This is the Devil's Slide here, that's Cinnabar Mountain, just before you get to Gardner. It's at Corwin Springs, the bridge, if you're familiar with that area. Back through the 90s, we were clipping this to document the kinds of plants, the amount of plants, and the proportion that those plants were in over time and how it changed over time. Now, normally I would have an easel up here and I would give you some diagrams, but I'll just kind of wave my hands a little bit and to describe those things. But here in 93, this was in excellent condition. That 70% over on the right side, that's a similarity index. A similarity index is a quantitative measure of health. That's my coinage of it, because we actually take and clip the current year's growth by species of the different plants. So it's quantitative, it's not qualitative. And so it really points to, just because you have the right species composition, in this case that's about 70% blue bunch you're seeing in 1993, doesn't mean that it's necessarily healthy. Because if it's got a bunch of old crap in it, similarity index, and this is good news for the ranchers because it shows that undergrazing or under disturbance creates a potential for weed invasion because it's not producing near potential. Because a higher potential creates a more weed resistant area, and I'm gonna show you that here in a minute. And it also creates a more drought resistant, because if I drew a graph right here, and we had on the vertical axis we had production, and the horizontal axis was time. From year to year, you would see with a low similarity, which is this on the bottom. This is 30 years later, 2023. We've lost the blue bunch wheatgrass, and there was about 5 to 10% needle and thread in that community, and now it's dominated by needle and thread, and we've got cactus. We also had another shrub in there that I'm going to talk about here in a minute. That's a decreaser shrub. Now, what's a decreaser, you say? Decreasers are those plants that tend to dominate in that potential native plant community or in the climax. Okay? They're the ones that are best able to utilize the light, the moisture in the ground, and the rainfall that falls there, the periodic drought cycles, and all of that, and stay productive, and that sort of thing. They also cycle water much better. We'll talk about that more here in a minute. But so the needle and thread, because of heavy use, they actually fenced this area off, this particular ranch, and they started grazing it hard. It was getting grazing before too, and we'll show you that, but by wildlife, bison and elk. So the combination of that has taken this down. Keep down the shoot, you kill the root, especially at certain times of the year. It has even a much greater impact, and during drought. And remember I said that drought we came through, 1998 to 2007? That I saw range all over changing. And a lot of it, we can't economically get it back, okay? So now here, just so you note here, there was crested wheatgrass over here along the road, and it spread out into this. Crested wheatgrass has a much less desirability and nutrition profile and palatability to wildlife and livestock, and so it moved out into that area, and it can take closer grazing and still maintain itself. But what's it doing? It's taking it from the soil and making it less fertile. And the nutritional profile is not super good for a very long period of time. So the natives have a much wider nutritional profile. So that's pretty dramatic. We went from producing 70 to 80% of its potential to 25% of its potential. And we have a remnant of blue bunch. It's out of the screen down here. The hill drops off. We get big boulders, and the blue bunch, little small blue bunches, they're going right next to the rock where the bison and the elk and any livestock that they're grazing can't access it. So this plant here, as we continue to graze hard, this plant will fall out, the blue bunch, which it did right there. And then we have plants like, let's see where to go. The needle and thread. This is the one that came in. This is an increaser plant. It was there 5 to 10%, but you took off the blue bunch. What do you increase? Light. So these ones that were in the understory of those big blue bunches, but just a small percentage, then just flourish because you opened them up to all the light and the resources, and then they're lower to the ground. How easy would it be to get more than 50% of this particular plant? It's not as easy because more of its foliage is closer to the ground. So that's how you can tell with increaser or decreaser. The increasers were there, but in small proportions. Another increaser that we see out there, very common, and it was on this site too, is fringe sagewort. Low growing, not real palatable. Sheep will make more use of it. Cattle make very little use of it. I've seen this for decades on ranches all over the state and around in other states around the West. Just large mats of this sort of plant. Fringe sagewort. Has a sagey smell, but it's a half shrub. And so let's move on. Okay. Now I want to show you a site out in Melstone. This is where the Musselshell River, it's east of Roundup, it's where the Musselshell River takes a 90-degree bend north. It's heading east and then it turns north. And right there, there's a cemetery, the Melstone Cemetery, just east of town. And this was interesting because I had, at the time, discussions with scientists, and they were saying like, no, blue bunch, and many range scientists, many very well-respected range scientists. Blue bunch does not grow on deep soils in eastern Montana. And this is what we call, and this actually was a better than 20-inch deep, loamy soil. It was within the cemetery, but just outside the areas of the headstones. The oldest headstones date back to around the mid to late 1880s. So very old. And all the old timers I could talk to, and this was back through the 90s, early 90s, through the 90s, we clipped this. And the old timers I talked to said, no, it hasn't had, occasionally some calves or a cow gets in there. Or we've had a range fire occasionally, which is good because that meant that there was a little bit of disturbance, but not too much disturbance. Because without disturbance at all, what happens over time? The plants get undergrazed and they start lowering production. And then we see weeds. And I could give you examples, but I don't have time around the state. But notice, what do you notice here on the left side of the screen versus the right? Now, I know I got arrows, but if you just look at it, you don't even have to read it. On the left side, dominated by blue bunch wheatgrass. And that really amazed a lot of my soil science friends and other people to see this. And on the right, what is that? What's that? Yeah, that's right, Doug. That's yellow sweet clover. So, what are sweet clover years? Okay, I'll describe it. Sweet clover is a plant that all of the homesteaders brought over way back when. They didn't have fertilizers, fossil fuel generated fertilizers. They brought sweet clover. They'd plant it with their winter wheat. And sweet clover is a biennial. The first year it germinates. It's there in a rosette. The wheat comes up. You harvest the wheat off the top. And then you plow down the sweet clover. And on dry land, that's worth about 60 pounds of actual nitrogen. That's pretty good, especially if you paid for any fertilizer lately. Anything I can get free, that's what I want. Well, so the next year and so because they did that on these homesteads and then they went belly up and then they went into ranches, there was all this sweet clover in the ground and it sits there for years, all that hard seed. And then, so that first wet year, enough moisture to germinate those seeds. Then the second year, if it's wet also, then it grows up and gets tall like that. That's the second year, and that's the true sweet clover year. But you got to have 2 wet years in a row. But the interesting thing is, it's not a terrible weed, but I'm not going to get into all that right now. And it can be utilized. There are some things you got to watch, but it really points out to something that isn't healthy. And that's what weeds do. Weeds are really like nature's scab system. If you get a cut on your body, and it's caused by maybe something you're doing, you're irritating it, and you get that cut and you keep doing this, what's it going to do? It's going to keep bleeding. And if it gets bleeding bad enough, then pretty soon you're going to pass out. Okay? And you might even eventually die if you just keep doing that. But we don't do that. We stop. We stop whatever is the problem. Was the bleeding the problem? Not necessarily. It was the irritation that I was doing. That created the problem. So I have to stop that. So weeds help to fill in that area, to heal it. But the problem is that we have different types of weeds. We have weeds that I call cancerous weeds. Those are weeds that come in on the site just like a weed. Now, let me give you one example of some of those weeds. Curly cup gumweed, sticky weed, it's a biennial, it's native. I know a lot of ranchers who will spray that weed, and they're told to spray it by professionals that are well-meaning, but often they're selling a certain product, and that product is the answer to your problem. Again, we have to focus on an array of alternatives to get the best fit for your operation. An earlier speaker said every ranch is different. They have unique situation, both physically, nutritionally, and you and your family and your situation is different. So we want to tailor all of that to that. So we have to look at an array of alternatives. So these noxious weeds or cancerous weeds are different. Here's a native weed, kind of like curly cup, and this is Herigold aster. It gets a yellow flower on it, and it can get thick on an area. But do we need to necessarily spray it? No. Change what the real problem is, the irritant that's causing that problem. Having a weed is like clotting on your skin. That's a good thing. You need that, or you'll keep bleeding. And that's the same on the landscape. And if you don't change that, then the land starts to do some things that I'll show an illustration of here in a minute. So on the left, this is a 80% similarity on the left, 25% similarity on the right. Notice that really we have next to no, only trace amount of yellow sweet clover here. But as far as you can see out on the landscape in those years, those sweet clover years, and I've seen it all over Montana, up the Shields Valley, everywhere in Montana you can see it, particularly where homesteading happened. And a lot of times we think that, oh, that ground was never turned over. It was turned over. It was a lot of ground we think, oh, that's all native. It was turned over. If they could put a plow to it, most of it was. Even off of the Snowies out of Harlowton. All that rocky, shallow, and that's a silty, limey, drouthy. It's full of gravel, holds about 1.5, 1.25 inches in the whole profile of water. They turned that over. So, okay. So here, production-wise, in an average year, this is producing about 1,300 pounds, but it might vary from 950 to 1,1600, but that's not a huge variation. Remember I said, I didn't tell you this, you get high similarity, the production variation goes more like this. Your highs and lows aren't a lot different. But the problem here when you get the low similarity is, and I want to point out this low similarity stuff here can be invaded by weeds of all kinds, and this is producing about 400 acres in an average year, but it might go up to 1,000 pounds in a really wet year because you're getting tons of this stuff, okay? And then go down to 150 pounds in a really dry year. It has this huge oscillation in production, which makes it very difficult for you to weather drought. Because then we're trying to up. And there's a lot of grasses, and I'm going to talk about those grasses here, but I want to point out that this is the edge of that maintained potential. In wet years, they would mow out here. And this plant community was the exact same thing that was outside the fence for as far as you could see. And that was things like low-growing prairie June grass, short-lived perennial, about as much growth, leaves, as you see above ground, is about how much root you have below ground by weight. Not going to have a lot here. The fringe, lots of fringe sagewort. Okay, lots of that. And then needle and thread, very low-growing, smaller than this one. And blue grama. Some people call it buffalo grass, but it grows leaves like this in Montana. Okay, very low growing. It's trying to keep its growth lower. Those are all increasers. But then I got to talk about invaders. The invaders are non-native plants, and those are those cancerous weeds, like cheatgrass, okay, from the Mediterranean, or Japanese brome, its cousin, these winter annuals. And you'll see this in southwest Montana a lot. Out on the prairies, you see more Japanese brome. But you'll see these up on hillsides. I call them like range pimples, because you'll see them, there's just a little patch there, they're light growing, and sometimes you've got tumble mustard growing in there, which is an introduced annual. And those are openings. I heard, 40 years ago, and I still hear it today, where some professionals and ranch advisors and scientists will even say this, is that of all kinds of disciplines, that these weeds come in and invade and they displace the natives, like those bad weeds, But that's not the process. The weeds are actually healing. They're healing because we've created an opening in that plant community, in this good plant community right here. We never saw these, this come in. I remember back in the 90s when I'd give presentations and old-time ranchers would go, wow, that's good. That I hadn't heard that before because they'd seen stuff like this. But I have to say, the one I show you of the Gardner Basin, if you're coming on the tour, you're going to see a lot of stuff like that. You're going to see that stuff. And a lot of people would not believe that would grow what I showed you unless you saw it. But I can tell you dozens of sites like this, and we've lost those sites. And so people won't believe what I'm saying. A lot of the people who have seen those things before me have passed on. People I learned from, they're not even with us anymore. See? There's no record of this. And so people are now changing what that potential is, what really weed resistance is. And they don't even talk about that. And they're describing things that are going like this as the potential. And I see this all over the West. So we have to be careful. And we're lucky in Montana that we still have a little bit of those potentials still that we can go see. Most ranches I go on, I can find a little bit to show a rancher, or sometimes a lot. But it's getting less and less. But sites like this are being lost. This site is lost now because now they've filled it in and they've put, more graves out into those areas, which, not faulting them for that, but we're losing those. And even back in the late 80s and early 90s, we'd have these discussions and people wouldn't believe you. Now, the people who came out and did this with me would believe it. So here's where it's mowed, or not mowed. You can see the ground cover. The drier the site is, the more that some bare ground is a natural part of that site. The wetter it is, we shouldn't have any bare ground. See? And and so we need to understand that the roots below ground and the diversity of the plants can hold the world together and make it healthy. So here's the 25% where it was mowed. That's what it looks like. Not very healthy. The most productive thing is in the sweet clover years. So, here's in 94. Look at that sweet clover here. It's the most productive thing. And look at outside here. But look right in this area here is that remnant area that's native. And the sweet clover never came in. Trace, but essentially didn't come in. Just another look at it. Okay, so invaders are those plants that come in after the increasers increase for a while. Like here's another increaser, and this is Idaho fescue. This comes in, it varies across the northwest United States and into the northern, southern, into the northern Rockies, and onto the prairies, but at about 15 to 16 inches. Some areas in southeast Montana about 17 inches. It depends. Wind and other things. I mentioned that site in the Gardner Basin we'll look at tomorrow, and in the picture up here, silty limey. Lime ties up the availability of water in the profile. So even though I said that was 11 inches, it's acting more like 10 or 9 inches. It's desertic, and some of the species reflect that. Now I have to mention, so invaders are the ones that after the decreasers leave or are grazed out, then the increasers come in. They tend to be a little bit shorter growing, less productive, sometimes not real nutritious like the fringe sagewort, but they're shorter growing, and so then they have to absorb the grazing pressure, and so they start to decrease. They're still an increaser. And that's when we get the invaders, non-natives. And there's a variety of different ones we get. Now in this picture you can see in this picture you can see the cactus here. Classic increaser. It's native. There'll be trace amounts in these communities, but it's physically preventing grazing. That's what it's doing, physically. And then you can see lots of fringe sagewort here. And notice the spears of grass that have a blue tinge to them. Can you see that? That blue tinge? That's western wheatgrass. Western wheatgrass, I still don't understand why Wyoming and North Dakota have western wheatgrass as their state grass. Because western wheatgrass, often when we do certain types of grazing or we're feeding in an area, actually increases strongly. And it will be mixed with cheatgrass. You see this everywhere. How can that be a good thing? Well, I know a lot of folks who have changed their tune on that. Here's one thing to think about. Think about all of the grasses that we plant for our hay crops. What are some of them? Orchard grass, timothy, smooth brome, meadow brome, even the legumes that we plant. They're all introduced. Where do they come from? Even red top and Kentucky bluegrass, which is in our lawns, were brought over as pasture grasses and hay grasses. They come from Europe, where we get 40 inches around there, plus or minus, right around there, of rain. They're lush environments. In the Alps, and we put lots of nutrients on them. So if we fertilize them with manure and whatever, they grow. We irrigate them, they grow. You do that to blue bunch wheatgrass and stuff, it doesn't do much more. You fertilize it, doesn't do much more. Again, I don't have time. I can give you illustrations of that over the years. Ranchers who I knew working with, they put tens of thousands of dollars into irrigating native rangeland. And all they did is change it to Kentucky bluegrass. They made it green a little longer, which attracts more grazing of the regrowth. And as you know, what that does to the root systems. And then those plants die out. And now you've made a very drought intolerant community. And we want drought resistance. That's what we want to build into your ranch, and weed resistance. So I have to talk also about, so western wheatgrass, to finish that thought, is the one grass that we actually can irrigate and fertilize, and it grows more. So that you'll see it in these summers like this summer where we get lots of rain throughout the summer, and it's a cool season grass, and it grows and grows and grows. I was just out on a friend's place down Ennis this weekend, and he was showing me how he put the irrigation out there on this rangeland, and his western wheatgrass was tall and thick, and his blue bunch was like not really liking it a lot. And so he's really shifting it to western wheatgrass. Now for him that may be okay, but that's not generally what we want to do. And another case in point, it's the one native grass that we plant in our water spreading dikes in eastern Montana with our alfalfa. That's how we raise our hay in eastern Montana where we don't have any surface water. Okay, and we use western wheatgrass. So it's an increaser grass. If we're down in the sub-irrigated or overflows, maybe a decreaser there. So. Okay, so weeds. There are our invaders, like spotted and diffuse knapweed. Here's a picture I took this summer down the Paradise Valley, just south of us here. And it's interesting because you look out there, lots of grass and kind of looking pretty good. But if you really look carefully, right here in the middle of the picture, there's a plant that almost blends right in with everything. Anybody know what that is? No, it's not marijuana. That is sulfur cinquefoil. Now, have you heard of sulfur cinquefoil? Okay, what I'm going to say is this is the worst cancerous weed we have. I put it right at the top of the list. Does anybody, well, you don't have to admit it if you have it, but you don't notice it out there. That's one of the number one problem with it is you don't notice it's there. And because there's like 30 other species of cinquefoils, potentilla, out there, and they're native, and they're not a problem. This comes in there, and it is a problem. It's a cancerous weed, doesn't want to give up the site. Here's a picture of a ranch worked on years and years ago, back when I first was hearing about sulfur cinquefoil in Montana, back in probably the middle 90s. And on the left side of the fence is it's a horse ranch, and you can see daisy, call it Shasta daisy, but it's an oxeye daisy is the more common name in Montana, and then spotted knapweed all through this. There's actually some leafy spurge in here too, but look right in here. This is all sulfur cinquefoil, and often the flowers are closed during the day, but this thing was the last thing these horses would eat. In fact, they never ate it. And on this side, this isn't great grass, but pretty good, and it's resisting the weed invasion. But right here where the animals are trailing a lot, because nutritionally they're deficient over here in a few other things, they're really wearing this down. But notice that the fence is leaning this way, and the horses, they're looking for something more than they can find here. Okay. Moisture is limiting on rangelands. When the rangeland is dominated by increaser and invader plants, those smaller statured plants and those non-native plants, those cancerous weeds, you get more bare ground. And runoff increases dramatically. You can see this here. This is at about 6.5, 7 inches precip. This is down in northern Wyoming on the Pryor Mountain Wild Horse Range. And Wyoming, big sagebrush, and halogeton. Halogeton we could call a cancerous weed. It's an annual, and it's poisonous to sheep pretty dramatically. So, but very little grass to no grass. You can see the water flow patterns and the blowing here. And in fact, our wind erosion, we documented up to 2.5 feet. Here you can see nature's trying to keep some type of cover on the ground, and that's prickly pear cactus. 2.5 feet right to there. Very dramatic. And water erosion also increases. We have all these exposed soils. And down in that country, it was during the latter part of the drought we were doing this study, and easily we were 120 degrees out there in those couple summers we were doing inventory down there. But I have to just tell you this. I was sitting with someone who was helping me with the inventory here, and we were discussing, and he was from that area, and he ranched, and we were discussing whether this was natural or this was excessive as far as this runoff and erosion and the ground cover, if it should be something a lot different. And his view was that, no, I don't think there's been a lot of erosion here. This is just the way it is, water or wind. And he lived down in that area. But it's interesting, and you ranchers can testify to this, is if you're not out there when those events happen, those extreme rainfall events like happened a few years ago up at Melville, well, a number of years ago, probably, that's almost 30 years ago too. It is 30 years ago, where they got like 7 inches in an hour or so. And it was the ranchers in that area up at Melville, they were telling me, yeah, we were floating, animals and farm equipment right up into the rafters of our barns. That's how deep the water was. At least that was their description, and it was huge. And those things happen. And this year we had some major rains. I don't know about that intense in that short of a time, but what happened is, we disagreed on that one, and so we were going down to the motel at the end of the day down at Lovell, Wyoming, and we looked back and a big rain shower came over. Big rain shower came over. The next morning we went, whoa, we're just looking back that way. I'm glad we got out of there. Next morning, there was big front-end loaders taking off the county roads, sediment that was like 6 foot deep that had run out of the drainages. And with our four-wheelers, we were just racing through there before. Well, we couldn't then because there were cut banks that were up to 6 foot cuts down into those drainages. So it had all changed. And then for the next 2 years, we would just see big clouds of dust blowing off of the horse range. So it happens. And sometimes we're not there to see the event of change, what really created that change. So the result is a less productive range that's less resistant to drought and weeds. Because here's the thing, we also see situations like this erosion pavement. And that's because wind blowing the fines off. And we think that, and a lot of people thought this in this area too, but I've seen this all over the state where you see all this at the surface, and then you dig down in it, and it's actually not that much rock in the profile. It's just leaving all that rock because the fines are blown away and that sort of thing. See? That's called an erosion pavement. Okay, and there's what it looks like. And here we got black sage on a silty, limey soil. So what happens is we get extremely high surface temperatures, and let me give you an example. I'm going to use an invader, and that's spotted knapweed. Spotted knapweed takes 24 hours to germinate with moisture. That's all it takes. And it likes direct sunlight. So if you put mulch on the surface of the ground and take away the light, the germination goes way down. Okay? What does grass like blue bunch wheatgrass take? It takes sometimes 2 weeks, but usually up to a month or more of moisture next to the seed to break dormancy and grow. That's why people in town, they mulch their lawns to keep the moisture closer to the surface to germinate that seed. But weeds, being healing in nature, they'll produce tens of thousands of seeds per plant, or thousands of seeds per plant, particularly in wet years like this year. They'll keep producing seed, multiple crops, and then they germinate quickly in these very harsh conditions, even in a gravel pit. See? And so that's nature's healing system. So how long does that seed stay in the soil? Well, it depends. Spotted knapweed, up to 11 years. But the winner is woolly mullein, a biennial. A lot of people don't worry about it. It gets a big, tall stalk. Over 100 years. Over 100 years, that seed stays in the soil. How long does blue bunch wheatgrass seed stay in the soil? 3 years. 3 years and it rots away. Does blue bunch wheatgrass produce viable seed every year? No. Only periodically. And I'll just leave it at that. But we could talk a lot more about that. So when we get these depleted landscapes where we've taken away that topsoil, these cancerous weeds like Dalmatian toadflax will increase. Now here's a piece of ground I worked on in the mid-'80s along the Rocky Mountain front. And they had a lot of leafy spurge in the area. And they told me the story back in about 1956, 57. They first saw this plant, leafy spurge, and in the area, and they didn't know what it was. So they took it to their extension agent, asked him, well, what is it? And he didn't know what it was, but he sent it to the university, and they finally figured out, hey, this is leafy spurge. But they really didn't know anything about it, and they didn't do anything about it. And so it continued to spread until we got up in the 80s, and it was just a huge problem. But here we've got a depleted range resource. We're looking at all of those increaser plants and lots of increased bare soil. This is an area that receives about 17 inches precip annually, 16 to 17. And they're still dealing with it, but it's at a huge cost. So leafy spurge. And a lot of you may be familiar with that around here. But here, we want a weed-resistant situation. So if given a chance, nature would like to put back those best adapted plants, but it needs to have two things. You need to have the soil still intact, and you need to have, that's number one, that little bit of organic matter still intact. And then number two, you still need to have the decreaser or those potential plants like blue bunch, spiked fescue, green needlegrass. There's a whole array of these decreaser plants that we would want still intact. Here you can see 6-inch plant pedestaling. This is up in Marr County. We still have blue bunch there, but it's just hanging on here and there. But lots of wind erosion here and water. So, to increase a good grazing plan that will increase the profitability of the drought and weed resistance, because this is one of the things that you need, some kind of a plan to go through in the future, because otherwise I'm reacting to what nature is doing instead of me being proactive, see? And then I get ahead of the curve. I get ahead of the snowball. And it doesn't run me over, I'm controlling it. Okay, so I need something, a plan that does this, increases the drought and weed resistance of our ranches and grazing lands. Will consist of these two essential components. And I know it sounds basic, but it'll address the nutritional needs of the livestock or the animals, and it will provide for the health of the forage. I was working on a ranch out in Oregon. We did a big ranch, and it was, we were getting the energy all figured out, but here's the thing. It's not the absolute amount of energy or the absolute amount of protein that you feed to an animal to keep them healthy and productive. It's the proportion that they're delivered to the ruminant. This is key in grazing management. It's the proportion. So this particular ranch, one of the things I cautioned them, okay, we've got the energy kind of figured out. You're going to have a framework to do that. But out in that country, they were weaning calves that are 400 pounds, 6.5 months, 4.5. That was their average weaning weight. They have a slump that they're not recognizing where their proportion is out of balance. The protein is not enough to get them to utilize that energy. And I've told this to ranchers for years, when we started learning this, because this is a lot of new information since the 90s, middle 90s in fact, to late 90s, is that you never, during a drought, want to be grazing your forages and have your animals losing weight. That energy is the number one cost on your operation to provide to your livestock. Protein is a lot less. And we can supplement that and strategically supplement and keep those animals on a gain. Because otherwise, you graze that and you lose weight, that energy, you can't get it back. And then you've got to go buy it and then ship it in, or ship your cattle somewhere else, or sell. And that's all those decisions that you ranchers make, and they cost money. So here's just some examples of left side healthy, right side not functioning healthy. Water is a big thing. We want to get, on the left side, you're going to get a lot more water going down into the ground, and it's going to just be a synergistic effect. Same on the right. You're going to get a lot more water, evapotranspiration, or hanging up in snow on the tops of all the sagebrush. And then it sublimates, just like it does in a forest, a thick forest stand. It'll sublimate into the atmosphere. We get less into the ground for our streams, for clean water. And I can't tell you how many ranchers I've had, and I'm going to show you an example of that. When you have this kind of range, they start saying, you know, as my range improves, I'm starting to see springs come back. And that isn't just because we were in a drought and now it's starting to rain. It's a long-term effect. And getting the water into the ground rather than letting it run off is the key. I got to show you land with a good grazing plan. Here's a typical stream in eastern Montana. Ephemeral flow, periodic pools, sometimes very few pools, eroded banks, sloughing, invaders like Russian olive, and widely spaced cottonwoods, if we have any cottonwoods left at all. And only one species, plains cottonwood, our most drought tolerant. But here's the same drainage, just across the fence. And what's going on here? And this isn't springs here, folks. This is just a better functioning system, a defined channel. We have the right species of sedges and rushes, woodies here. Yeah, we still have some Russian olive, but we got different age classes and 2 different species of cottonwoods. Here's back across. This particular rancher, he wanted his, because he watched his neighbor over a 16-year period change his ranch, and riparian has the quickest opportunity to change. His uplands went crazy though too, in a good way. Because the only reason I was out there helping him was he wanted to burn sagebrush, and he wanted to know how to go about doing that. And we looked at what the real problem was. Because remember, that's what we're really talking about here. What is the problem? Not address the symptom. Because I know I go in the doctor and I may not be eating right and I'm smoking like a chimney, and then I'm wondering, well, you know, fix me, doc. And so he'll give me some pills, or maybe he has to operate on me and cut some stuff out. I don't know. But I'm not addressing the problem. So we got to be sure we're addressing the real problem. So here, back in 2011, we had floods in this area of the state. In fact, a lot of the areas of the state had a 150-year flood on this drainage. And a head cut started on this guy's place, and it started moving upstream. And but then it got to his fence line and it stopped. This particular rancher had been doing this management, and you can see it. And above his place, it goes back to what it looks like below his place. It's just this one green spot. You can see it on the air photos. It was so dramatic. I hadn't been there in years after we had planned it, and I knew he was doing a good job following things, but I didn't know how well, because back then we didn't put monitoring out. It wasn't until after this time that we started really doing monitoring, you know. And so there the head cut stopped. once it hit all the woodies and the other vegetation. And I want to point out that there's decreaser forbs. This is Maximilian sunflower. It isn't all just, forbs are like 25 to 30% protein, these warm season forbs that as the grass is dry, I call them little mineral and protein blocks scattered across the range. Free protein, free minerals. They go down with a deep taproot and bring minerals that your grasses that are 3 to 5 feet cannot access. Okay, and they have a certain nutritional profile. They're providing energy, yes, but you need these forbs for all these different minerals. And then we had all age classes, but we also had not just plains cottonwood, the drought one, but the narrow leaf cottonwood also. So over 16 years. Now that's what a narrow channel and a perennial water. Water is huge if you're running your livestock operation or you're interested in wildlife. Okay, just want to show you some quick changes. This is another ranch, south central Montana. And this particular rancher said the most important thing he did was his grazing management plan. But we have accelerating practices and facilitating. Facilitate management. Accelerating is what most of us like to do right off. I want to take a pill to fix the problem, so I go right to spraying and all that stuff, but I continue to do what's creating the problem. So you can see this happened between 7 and 14. And if you're thinking that 14 was a wetter year, no. It was a little bit less moisture in the growing season than 07. So but I have to say, he used an accelerating practice. There was leafy spurge in here, and he was spot spraying that out. But it was his management, and there was a little collateral damage, obviously, in places with the big sage. But a lot of the big sage is being masked by the taller grass. Oops. So I'm just going to run through this real quick and finish up. If I can get it to move. Here you can see a patch of leafy spurge. He did treat that, but it was his grazing management, and that particular rancher would say that. So this is on that same ranch, or this. You can see that the sagebrush is still out there. Here he was spot spraying knapweed. He had knapweed out in there. Those things aren't becoming a problem. And I wish we could talk more about nutrition and everything that's going on here, but interest of time, just remember, when people are telling you buy your feed, I had people buying feed based on protein during the drought. And then they found, oh, that's not so good. I didn't look at the digestibility, and I didn't look at the balance between the protein and that energy. That's the key, because it didn't work as well for them. So this or this. Well, thank you.